been holding on to this secret for more than 30 years. I never intended to share it, partly because I signed a whole stack of non-disclosure forms during my time in service, but mainly because I couldn't wrap my own mind around what happened. Now I'm retired, and the kids are grown and out of the house. I spend a lot of my days browsing different channels online, and that's how I stumbled onto your YouTube channel. Seeing other folks share their bizarre accounts gave me the push I needed to send you this email. Please keep me anonymous. Let me start with some background. I'm a retired U.S. Marine. Back in the late 1980s, I was temporarily assigned to security detail at Nellis Air Force Base, just outside Las Vegas. It wasn't my usual station, but we'd occasionally rotate in for joint training exercises. I'd been around bases my whole adult life, yet Nellis always had a different feel. Lots of restricted areas, hush-hush talk about certain hangars, and the sense that there were layers to the place most people never saw. I don't want to bog you down in too many side details, but I figure context might help. One evening, in the fall of 1988, don't ask me the exact date, I wish I could remember, I got assigned to a perimeter patrol that ran a bit beyond what most would consider normal base boundaries. It was basically the desert outskirts, a zone out near where the barbed wire fences meet miles of nothing but scrub brush and rocky hills. Another Marine was supposed to patrol alongside me, but he got pulled for a different detail last minute, so it was just me and a Humvee. Normally we'd just circle around, check for trespassers or broken fencing, that sort of thing. We rarely encountered anyone aside from the occasional lost civilian who wandered onto federal land. But this night felt off right from the get-go. The air was too still, no wind, no insects buzzing. If you've spent time in the desert at night, you know it can go dead silent. But this was a heavier sort of silence, hard to explain. I remember stopping to stretch my legs. The moon was out, giving everything a pale glow. That's when I noticed something weird, a faint light coming from behind a rocky outcrop about 100 yards away. This was definitely off the standard perimeter route. My gut told me to drive on, radio it in, let someone else handle it. But curiosity, or maybe a misplaced sense of duty, got the better of me. I decided to approach quietly on foot. As I got closer, I saw that the light was coming from what looked like a narrow entrance at the base of a ridge. Not a cave exactly. It looked too perfectly cut, almost like a door set into the hillside. There were no obvious markings or signs. I figured maybe I'd stumbled onto a restricted storage bunker. They do have hidden structures out in that area for various reasons. Training, equipment testing, who knows? But I'd never heard of anything this far off the usual grid. I had my flashlight in one hand, sidearm holstered at my hip. I radioed to the base that I was investigating a possible unauthorized entry on the outer perimeter. I'm not even sure the dispatcher understood exactly where I was, but they said they'd note it, and that was that. Typical minimal response. The door wasn't locked. It was heavy, made of some metal that didn't reflect light much. Inside, a short tunnel led me to a dimly lit corridor. The walls were a dull gunmetal gray, and the lighting came from ceiling panels that hummed softly. My first thought was, this is a top secret site. I'm trespassing on something I shouldn't see. But I told myself I was in uniform, on official patrol, so I had every right to confirm whether this area was secure. I ventured in maybe 30 or 40 feet, carefully checking corners, mind racing with questions. The corridor branched off in two directions. Down one path, I thought I heard movement, a shuffling sound. My heart was hammering like mad, but I inched that way. My flashlight revealed more corridor, plus what looked like a metal door at the far end. Then the shuffling got louder, almost like claws scraping softly on the floor. That's when I saw them. They were tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more, and covered in scales that reflected a slick greenish-brown color under the overhead lighting. Their heads looked vaguely lizard-like, elongated snouts, ridges over the eyes, and I could see their arms were muscular with hands that ended in claws. There were two of them that I could see clearly, walking upright with a sort of hunched gait, as if they were used to being in tighter spaces. I didn't get the best look at their faces, because as soon as the beam of my flashlight swept across them, they jerked their heads toward me. Their eyes caught the light, yellowish with vertical pupils. I froze. Honest to God, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain screamed, this can't be real. Time seemed to slow down. These reptilian beings, they weren't wearing any clothing I could discern, though there might have been some straps or harness on them. If they made any noise, my pulse was pounding too loudly in my ears for me to notice. Then one of them took a step in my direction, and instinct took over. I stepped back, fumbled for my sidearm. I didn't want to shoot, partly because I wasn't even sure if they were hostile, and partly because what if this was some kind of bizarre training exercise with advanced animatronics? That idea flashed through my mind even though it seemed insane. Regardless, I unholstered my weapon, keeping it pointed down but ready. The reptilian paused, as if studying me. There was this tense moment where neither of us moved. Next thing I know, I heard a metallic clang from further down the corridor, like a door opening. More lights flickered on. I panicked, deciding that I was in way over my head. I turned on my heel and sprinted back the way I came, practically stumbling out the entrance and back into the cool desert air. My heart was slamming against my ribcage. By the time I reached my Humvee, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I booked it out of there, all sense of procedure forgotten. When I got back to base, I filed a quick incident report about an unknown structure. I left out any mention of lizard people because I didn't want to be labeled insane or get in trouble. Besides, I figured they'd either dismiss it or quietly handle it. The next day, I got called into a briefing room by two men in suits. Definitely not Air Force officers, and they didn't show any badges. They asked a lot of questions about what I saw, how far in I went, if I touched anything, if anyone else was with me. They weren't overtly threatening, but there was a definite undertone that made me uneasy. They told me point blank that what I'd witnessed was an experimental area testing advanced camouflage technology. They said if I valued my position, I'd sign some additional paperwork stating I would never speak of it again. I remember one line clearly: "For your own good, Marine, let's keep this off the record." After that, my perimeter duties were reassigned closer to the main base, and I never got anywhere near that sector again. Over the next few weeks, I did notice a black SUV or two trailing me whenever I left base for weekend passes, though that could have been my imagination running wild. When my rotation at Nellis ended, I transferred back to my regular Marine station. Life moved on. I kept my mouth shut all these years. I've never found a logical explanation for what I saw. I know our military can run some pretty out there experiments, but living, breathing reptilian beings. If they were suits or costumes, the realism was beyond anything I've seen before or since. And the way they moved, well, I've never witnessed animatronics or prosthetics that's smooth and lifelike. For years I tried to convince myself it was some advanced, highly classified test, maybe a psychological experiment. But seeing similar stories and cryptid encounters on your channel makes me believe there's a lot more going on. If it was purely an exercise, why would it be hidden so far from the normal base perimeter? Why the immediate clampdown from those suits? I never told my wife the full story, and I've lost touch with most of my old service buddies who were at Nellis around the same time. Nobody ever brought it up again. Alright, let me take you back to the fall of 2006. I was a seasoned park ranger at Yosemite National Park, having spent a good chunk of my life wandering, monitoring, and preserving the vast expanses of the park. It was my turf, you could say, and not much that happened there could escape my eyes or ears. I knew the lay of the land like the back of my hand. I've been in or near nearly every nook, cranny, and crevice of my territory. This day, I was out on a routine boundary patrol near the Ostrander Lake. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange hue. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the distant calls of a Steller's jay. It was peaceful as usual. I decided to check in on one of the lesser-used trails, a narrow path that wound through a dense stand of old-growth pines. It was there, as the light started to fail, that I saw something I couldn't explain. There was a figure standing off the trail in a clearing. At first glance, I thought it was a hiker, maybe someone in need of help. But as I approached, I realized this was no person. It stood towering over me with a posture that suggested that it knew a lot, a creature that knew how to stand its ground. Its skin was an odd, shimmering green, like the scales of a fish, but with the texture of leather. Its eyes were a bright, unnatural yellow, holding me in place with an intensity I've never felt before. I reached for my radio instinctively, but the static that came through was harsh, grating, and unnerving. The creature didn't move, even with the harsh static noise. It just stared, and I could see now that it had a kind of armor on its chest. Natural maybe, but who knows? Trying to keep my composure, I took a step back, slowly, to increase the distance between us. But the creature stepped forward, maintaining the close distance. I wasn't sure if it was a sign of intelligence or instinct, but I wasn't about to test which it was. Then it did something that will stick with me till my last day. It looked up to the sky and made a sound. It wasn't a growl or a hiss, but a kind of low hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate in the very air around us. I felt it in my bones, a sound that I knew was a call out to others like it. Then it started a series of clicking, as if it was responding to an unseen ally. Eventually, the creature turned and walked away with a gait that was eerily human-like. It moved with purpose and disappeared into the trees. I've heard stories from hikers and campers, tales of strange sights and sounds in the woods, but I always took them with a grain of salt. But now, here I was, a rational, trained park ranger, questioning the reality of what my own eyes had just seen. I didn't sleep much that night, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't just sit on this. It was too big, too strange. But I also knew I had to be careful about who I told. I've seen what happens when stories like this get out. They take on a life of their own, twisting into something unrecognizable. And the last thing I wanted was a circus descending on Yosemite. I love this park too much to let that happen. So I confided in my supervisor, expecting skepticism, maybe even a laugh. But the look on his face was grave, and he listened intently, asking only necessary questions. He believed me, or at least he believed that I believed what I'd seen, and that's all I needed. We decided to keep it quiet, to conduct a discreet investigation. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety, relieved that I wasn't alone in this, but anxious about what we might find. We started by combing through recent reports, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Missing hikers, strange sightings, reports of odd noises. We dug through it all. It was a few days later when I returned to the site of the encounter. My supervisor insisted I take someone with me, but I refused. This was personal. I found the clearing, and it was just as it had been, undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that the creature had been there at all. It was a clear day too, and the sunlight filtered through the pine needles. I remember thinking that it should have been beautiful, but all I felt was a hollow uneasiness. I took out my notebook, a small habit from years of documenting poachers and vandals. Methodically, I started taking notes of the area, anything that might be used as a reference. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt compelled to look for something, anything that could explain what happened. It was then I noticed something odd about the bark of a nearby tree. It was subtly scored in a pattern that wasn't natural. I examined it closer, and it became clear that it was a marking, deliberate and precise, not something made by nature. The marks were too uniform, too intentional. I took notes describing what it looked like. My hands were steady, trained by years of experience, but my heart was anything but. This was a clue, a tangible piece of evidence. It meant something, though I couldn't begin to guess what. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I continued my search, moving further and further out from the clearing, but I found nothing more. As the sun began to set, I headed back, the feeling of being watched creeping over me with every step. I told myself it was just nerves. Back at the station, I pored over the notes. Those markings were unlike anything I had seen in my career, neither human nor animal. That night, I finally managed to sleep, but it was fitful and filled with dreams of yellow eyes, and the hum that felt like something was really wrong. There was something here, something real and inexplicable, and I had to understand it. My duty as a ranger had always been to protect the park and its inhabitants, but now I felt a new duty, to uncover the truth of what was sharing the wilderness with us. The investigation continued, quieter and more determined than ever. We expanded our search, bringing in a few trusted colleagues, each of them as baffled as we were. Every lead, every strange report was followed up on, but they all led to dead ends. It was as if the creature, whatever it was, had vanished into thin air. We're still thinking about, even though it's over 25 years later, but it's more in the background now. But rest assured, if there is any future development, you'll be one of the first people I share it with. So there I was, out with my German Shepherd, Max, on our usual evening walk. We'd taken this route around the outskirts of our little town in upstate New York countless times. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but nobody really knows you for real. Well, at least not me. I moved here about 5 years ago, looking for a fresh start away from the city. I'm a freelance writer, which means I spend most days cooped up at home, just me and Max and the tapping of the keyboard. It was late September, and the leaves were doing their thing, turning all shades of fire. There was a chill in the air reminding me that winter was coming. We were on this stretch of path that runs parallel to the dense woods of the Adirondacks. The sun was setting and getting closer to the horizon, leaving behind a sky that looked like ink to me, with just the first few stars starting to peek through. Max was a bit more on edge than usual. His ears perked up as if he was trying to catch something I couldn't. I figured it was just a deer. We'd seen plenty in the woods before, but this time, he stopped dead in his tracks, staring into the trees with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tugged on his leash, trying to coax him along, but he was a statue, save for the low growl brewing in his throat. I squinted into the woods, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had caught Max's attention. That's when I heard it, a sort of clicking sound, like dry branches snapping, but rhythmic, deliberate. It was getting closer, and I could feel this pressure in the air, thick and heavy. I wasn't scared, not yet, curious maybe, but nothing I knew of made a sound like that. The clicking grew louder, and from the shadow of the trees emerged a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and thin to the point of emaciation. Its skin was ashen, stretched over its bones like parchment. Its eyes were just empty sockets, and there was no way to tell what it was looking at. The legends of the wendigo that I'd heard around campfires as a kid flooded back to me. Max's growl had turned into a full-on bark, the kind that says, danger. But the figure just stood there at the edge of the woods, unmoving and silent now. The air around us felt charged, and I knew we had to leave, had to get away from whatever this was and whatever was happening. My heart was racing, but I forced my feet to move, backing away slowly, not daring to turn my back on the figure. There was a stillness in the air that felt almost solid, like the world had paused on its axis. I didn't know what to do. Call for help, snap a photo, run. But my body seemed to have made the decision for me. The figure, the wendigo, if my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, had a presence that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. It was tall, way taller than any man I've ever seen, with limbs that seemed to stretch too long for its body. The moonlight gave its skin a silvery sheen and made its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, seem like voids. I reached down without looking, my hand shaking, and gripped Max's collar to have an extra hold on him. He was still barking, loud and fierce, but even his sounds seemed to be swallowed up by the presence around that figure. I wanted to shout at it, to ask what it was, why it was here, but my voice was stuck somewhere in my chest, not to mention that it probably would not have understood my words. And then, slowly, it moved. Or did it? The darkness played tricks, but I could have sworn it swayed, like a tree in a breeze that I couldn't feel. The clicking sound started up again, and this time, it was accompanied by a low, haunting whistle. The noise was unlike anything I'd ever heard. threading through the trees with an almost hypnotic quality. It was then, in that sliver of a moment, when my attention was split between looking at the figure and the strange sounds, that Max's collar slipped through my trembling fingers as he got away from me, dragging his leash. I gasped as I realized what was happening. He bolted towards the wendigo with a ferocity that matched the pounding in my chest. "Max!" His name ripped from my throat. I sounded raw and desperate, but he didn't pause one bit, didn't turn back. I had a split-second decision to make: go after him or stay safe on the path. My feet made the choice before my head did, propelling me forward after him, into the brush, twigs snapping beneath my boots. I could barely see Max now, just the lighter parts of his fur catching the moonlight as he got close to the figure. The closer he got, there was this weirdness in the air as it seemed to ripple, like heat over asphalt. My breath came in sharp gasps now, and my voice was lost as the wind picked up. But then, Max stopped, mere feet away from the wendigo. He wasn't barking anymore. He stood there, facing the figure, his body tense but not aggressive. The wendigo mirrored him, motionless, a statue carved from the night itself. The standoff lasted only moments, yet it felt like hours. I was close enough now to see them clearly: the deep grooves in the creature's skin, the unnerving stillness of Max. They were communicating somehow, in a language that went beyond words, a silent understanding that passed between them. And then, as if the moment was too fragile to hold, the wendigo turned, its form dissolving into the woods with the same eerie grace with which it had appeared. Max watched it go, then turned to look at me, his expression unreadable in the dark. I approached him slowly, half expecting him to run after the creature again. But as I reached him, he simply nuzzled his head against my leg, a gesture so normal and grounding that I could have cried. We walked back home, the woods silent behind us, the weight of the encounter heavy on my shoulders. Max stayed close, occasionally looking back as if to ensure the wendigo hadn't returned. When we got inside, I double-checked every lock, every window, but as the hours ticked by, the terror of the encounter began to fade, replaced by an unshakable curiosity. What had Max understood that I hadn't? What silent pact had passed between beast and dog in the heart of the Adirondacks? These questions haunted me, but as the first light of dawn crept through my windows, I knew one thing for certain: our walks would never be the same again. So I'll just dive right into this. I'm a professional ice sculptor. Yeah, you heard that right. I carve sculptures out of blocks of ice for events, parties, you name it. It's a job that not everyone can say they do. I've worked everywhere from high-end New York galleries to private events in Los Angeles. But this thing that happened to me while working changed my life. It happened up north, in Banff, Canada. It's a place where nature isn't just at your doorstep, it's looming over your shoulder. Now, I was there for a gig at this big outdoor winter festival a few years ago. They wanted something special, something that would stand out. So they flew me in to carve a life-sized figure of a legendary First Nations creature right there in the open, using a block of ice from the lake. The setting was picturesque, with the forest blanketed in snow. The festival was in full swing, and I was in my zone, chiseling away, lost in the rhythm of my craft, when the sun began to dip below the horizon, and the cold really started to bite. The crowds thinned, heading to warm up, but I had to finish the sculpture. That's when things got weird. The surroundings got quiet, like eerily quiet. No animal sounds, no wind, just silence. I'm used to the cold, but this felt like the air was being sucked out of the place. I should have taken that as a sign to pack up, but at that point I wasn't thinking this was bad, just weird. So I paused a bit to keep my head clear, and that's when I heard it, the cracking of branches, or should I say, the loud snapping of tree branches, like that loud popping noise that huge limbs can make. Also, it was deliberate and heavy. Before turning on my chainsaw again, I looked around the perimeter of where I was working, and that's when I saw it. Between the trees, there was this figure, tall and thin, impossibly thin, with arms that were too long, dangling by its sides. Its eyes were like this glowing, haunting red, and they were locked onto me. Now, I've heard stories, legends of this spirit of the lonely places, a creature where the cold and the hunger that never ends. I always thought it was just that stories. But there it was, and it looked hungry. Don't ask me how I knew, but I knew. It took a step forward, and every instinct in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't. And what I now know as a wendigo tilted its head, almost curious, and then let out a sound that I can only describe as a howl mixed with a scream. It was a call that seemed to pierce right through me. I even checked my ice sculpture thinking it could have cracked. That's the pitch I'm talking about here. I was rooted to the spot as if the ice beneath my feet had crept up and claimed me, holding me captive. My breaths came out in quick puffs, the only sound in the deafening silence that had fallen over the forest. The wendigo, because what else could it have been, cocked its head to the side, considering me with those burning red eyes. In that moment, I was sure it was the end for me. I was no stranger to the cold, but the chill that came off this thing was different. It wasn't just physical, it was existential. I thought about yelling for help, but my work area was off at the edge of the festival, and a good distance away. Who would hear me? No, I was alone with this creature. Then it did something I didn't expect. It spoke, or at least it made sounds that resembled speech, a garbled, distorted version of language. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words, but the intent behind them felt clear. It was a warning. I guess all the hissing that came with that garbled sounds is what made me know it was a warning. The creature took another step, close enough now that I could see the details of its emaciated form. The way its skin seemed to be stretched over its bones, the ragged remnants of what might have been skin hanging from its frame. It was a complete sign of starvation, of insatiable hunger and relentless cold. I don't know what compelled me. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation, but I found my voice. "What do you want?" I managed to yell, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. The wendigo paused, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of confusion, or was it amusement in its eyes? Obviously, it didn't answer, at least not in a way I could understand. Instead, it reached out a hand towards me, fingers elongated and ending in what could only be claws. That was the jolt I needed. The paralysis broke and I ran. I ran with a speed I didn't know I had, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. My only thought to get away from that thing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear that it might be right behind me, reaching out to grab me, was too much. I burst out of the tree line into the festival grounds, gasping for air, looking like a madman. The last few people there turned to look at me, concern and confusion on their faces. I must have looked a sight, with my wide eyes and my equipment clutched to my chest, as if it could protect me. I didn't stop to explain. I made my way to the organizer's tent, threw down my tools, and told them I was done. They tried to ask me what had happened, but I couldn't form the words. I just shook my head, grabbed my stuff, and left. I knew I wouldn't be able to explain it, not in a way that would make sense, not in a way that wouldn't have them questioning my sanity. I left the sculpture unfinished, a block of ice with only the rough shape of the creature I'd been hired to carve. In a way, it felt fitting. The real creature, the wendigo, was out there, unchained and unfathomable, and no amount of art could capture the essence of that encounter. I haven't been back to the festival since then, not that year or any year since. Also, I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if what I saw will ever come for me again. I know it's a crazy thought since I haven't been back to that area, but I can be triggered anywhere. That's what really stinks about all of this. I'm just having a hard time getting past it and hoping that sharing here might help. I work with critters, the kind that don't belong where they've ended up. Officially, my title on my business cards is Exotic Invasive Species Management. For example, I chase down iguanas on Miami golf courses and pry pythons from the Everglades. It's a good living down here. This thing I'm about to tell you about happened down in the swamps of Florida. near the Everglades National Park, a real wild place where the buzz of airboats and the crazy power of the cypress trees can make you believe in just about anything. A call came in about something picking off raccoons and gators in a way that didn't add up. No tracks, just parts and pieces of the animals left behind. The locals were spooked and kept talking about an unknown creature. I don't buy into the supernatural. Give me something I can see, touch, and trap. But these folks were looking at me like I was their last hope, so I agreed to check it out. I went out there in my truck, tools in the back, and ready to catch some sick or rabid animal. The day was closing out as I reached the swamps, which are also a hotbed for mosquitoes. I met with the guy who called me, a guy named Joe. He was a straight shooter, talked about the balance of nature, and how this thing, whatever it was throwing it off. Joe didn't use the words unidentifiable creature or cryptid when he talked to me. He didn't have to. His tone said enough. It was like he was trying to warn me without scaring me off. I told him I'd do what I could, set up some cameras and look for prints or patterns. Sunset in the Everglades is something else. The sky turns crazy colors, and the water catches the light in a way that's like nowhere else. It can even be peaceful until it's not. That night, as the swamp came alive, I felt something. And this was like being underwater. The feeling was muffled and heavy. I got to work setting everything up, all while looking around the area for any clues. I was focusing in crack and corners, and behind the vegetation, and that's when I saw it. Between the gnarled roots of a mangrove tree. It was human-shaped, but it was no human at all. This thing had the outline of a man, but it was wrong, distorted. Its eyes were crazy too. They were too bright, like the glare of headlights. I remember squinting, trying to make sense of the shape that I was seeing in the mangroves. Its form was very concerning to me, like the way it seemed to flicker with wind, along with the heavy scent of mud and decay. It wasn't just the outline that was wrong. It was as if the creature was struggling to maintain a shape. The limbs were elongated in places they shouldn't have been, and the torso seemed to twist unnaturally, like a warped tree. And the eyes were too intense, piercing through the darkness with a brightness that doesn't exist in anything that's alive. When you spend enough time in the swamps, you get used to the shine of gator eyes in the light. But this was different. This glare was steady and unblinking. Two spotlights that cut through the shadows like they were electric. I've heard of animals that can look like they've got a light inside them. Deep-sea creatures mostly. But this was the Everglades, not the Atlantic abyss. And in that moment, the job that I was there to do, tracking down invasive species, felt suddenly ridiculous. This wasn't an animal I could tag or a species I could log. I was totally out of my league. I wanted to call out to the thing, to break the silence, to figure out what was in front of me. But my throat was totally dry, and I couldn't form the words. Then, as if it sensed what I was thinking, the creature tilted its head, the movement jerky and insect-like. That's when I saw the skin, or what passed for skin, shifting and churning over muscles and bones that moved beneath it like snakes in a bag. It was mesmerizing in the most horrifying way. I don't know how long I stood there, but at some point the spell broke. Maybe it was a noise, a distant splash of a fish, or the call of a bird that reminded me I could move, that I could breathe. I took a step back, my boots squelching in the muck. The creature mirrored my movement, also stepping backwards into the tangle of roots and darkness. I didn't wait around to see what it would do next. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the spot where it had been, until the underbrush blocked my view. The sound of my own footsteps seemed thunderous at this point, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence that had been there just a few minutes ago. I was now aware of the dampness of the swamp air clinging to my skin, making my shirt stick to my back as I moved with as much calm as I could. All the while, I had the overwhelming sense that every step was being watched, calculated by something that was toying with the idea of following me. It was all I could do to keep my head together. By the time I got to my truck, the sky was dark and the stars were out. I threw my gear into the back and climbed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I turned the key and screamed out with happiness when the engine roared to life and the headlights cut the darkness. For a moment, I half expected to see the creature standing in the road, those unnaturally bright eyes staring me down and blocking my exit. But there was nothing, just the long dirt road winding out of the swamp. I drove without stopping, without looking in the rearview mirror, until I reached the little motel I was staying at. My hands shook as I checked in, and I must have looked a sight, with mud up to my knees and a wild look in my eyes. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the air conditioner hummed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bright, penetrating eyes. I racked my brain for some logical explanation, but science couldn't explain this for me. The next morning, I called Joe. I didn't go into details over the phone, just said I had something to discuss with him in person. We met at a small diner, a place that smelled of bacon grease and coffee. I could tell he knew something was off the moment he saw me. I figured he knew exactly what had happened. We sat down in a booth, and I laid it all out for him. He listened without interrupting, without questioning my sanity, his face filled with both concern and understanding. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You've seen it then," he said, his voice low. "The spirit of the swamp. It's not a skinwalker, not like our legends say, but something else. It's old, and it's been disturbed by the changes, by the invasions of both animals and people." He went on to talk about balance, about respect for nature, and how he believed that the creature I'd seen was a guardian of sorts. It was a tale as old as the swamp itself, passed down in whispers and sometimes shouted as a warning. I left Florida with more questions than answers, and needless to say, the experience changed the way I approach my work, the way I enter the wilderness. I now go with a sense that I'm a guest in a world that isn't mine to control. I still think about those eyes sometimes, and I know that out there, in the swamps of the Everglades, there's something watching what humanity is up to. And that's where I'll leave it. The story of the strangest encounter I've ever had, and the lesson it taught me about the unknown.